In this video, we're going to talk about the string data type. The goals in the first section will be to understand that strings are lists of characters, be able to write Python statements to input and output string values, and to use operators like the plus sign or the multiplication sign or the double equal sign on string data. So first, let's remember that the string data type, we've talked about that before, is a data type that's designed to store text. A string is just a sequence of characters. And these characters can be any kind of information. They could be a letter, they could be a number, they could be some other kind of value. Almost any character on the keyboard can be stored inside a string. So let's look at some examples of strings. Here are 3 examples at the bottom of your page. The first example is a string hello, so it stores HELLO plus an exclamation point. We can tell that's all part of the string data because it's delimited by double quotes. Here's a second string. It is Dr. A, and that's also delimited by double quotes. And so it's easy to see that text information can be stored appropriately using a string. You can also store numeric information in a string. For example, I could store 95 space 1/2 to mean 95 and a half, and I could store that in a string. So really, the kind of information that you store in there is unlimited. Any keys on the keyboard could be characters that are part of a string. Now, we're already familiar with how to perform input and output with string variables. We've been doing that all semester. So if you want to receive information and store it in a string, you just use the regular input command that we've been using, input, and then provide the prompt inside the parentheses. And then the information that's read in from the user, Python automatically treats that as a string and will store it in your variable that's over here on the left-hand side of the assignment operator. So suppose that we were storing information in a variable called last name, and we were prompting the user to enter information about the user's last name, and the user typed in the value Smith. What would get stored in the variable last name? If you guessed that it would be the value Smith, that's right. So it would store Smith inside the variable. It doesn't really store the double quotes, but a lot of times I'll put them in there just so we help ourselves remember that it's string information. What about if we entered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 whenever we were prompted for the last name? What would get stored as the last name? You guessed that it would store 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You are completely correct. The computer does not know or care that those are numbers. It just takes whatever information you type in, and that's what it stores as the last name. So the computer doesn't make any judgments about how that's probably not really somebody's last name. Just takes whatever is entered as the user input and stores it in your variable. We also know how we can display information from a text variable, a string, to standard output. And we do that with the print command. We've been using that all semester long. If you want to print a literal value like hello, you just say print and then enclose your literal value in double quotes. You can also print text that is stored inside a variable, like the value of our last name variable that we were just working with. And of course, you can also print out a combination of the two. You can have a literal value and a variable's value. If you do that, just make sure you separate them with the comma. That helps them to be formatted properly in the output statement. So suppose that we had a last name and it was storing the value Smith. What would print for each of these 3 output statements? Well, the first one would print the text literal hello. The second one would store the contents of the variable last name. So if last name is storing the value Smith, it would print Smith to the screen. And then finally, the last one would print the combination of the literal value and then the contents of the variable Smith. And even though there's a comma in our output statement, Python replaces that with a space. So it would just have hello space Smith as part of the output. Super. So we also have some other operators that are defined to work on strings. We're going to talk about a few of them in this video. These are things that we typically think of as being arithmetic operators, things that work on numbers, but they also happen to work on strings. And we've talked about most of these before. The first one's the concatenation operator. It looks like the plus sign. And we think of the plus sign as adding numbers together. When it's used with strings, it concatenates or joins those string values together. So if you said full name equals last name concatenated with the comma concatenated with first name, it's going to join all of those strings together. So there's 3 different strings there: the last name, the comma, and then the first name. And so if last name stored Smith and first name stored John, then after that statement executed, full name would store Smith, that's the value of the last name, and then a comma, and then the first name, John. And we didn't include any spaces up here, so it wouldn't include spaces in that. But if you wanted to include a space maybe after the comma, you could add that into your concatenation statement, and that would work just fine. We can also use the multiplication operator, the asterisk, to repeat a particular string value multiple times. So for example, if we had a string literal like hello, and we said repeat that 3 times and store the result in silly greeting, then Python would oblige and take our string literal hello and repeat that 3 times, and then store that result back into our variable silly greeting. So if we printed that to the screen, if we said print silly greeting, it would print hello, hello, hello. So those are 2 common operators. Another common operator is the assignment or the equality test operator that checks to see if the value of a particular string is equal to a particular value. So suppose you wanted to know whether a string that the user entered as a password to his or her account was the actual literal value password. So we would prompt the user to enter their password, store it as this variable password, and then our goal is to figure out, does this information that they entered actually equal the literal string password? The conditional statement for that would be if password, that's the variable, is equal to, that's the 2 equal signs, that's the equality test, and we want to see if it's equal to the string password. Which is kind of a silly password, but honestly, it's like one of the most popular passwords on the planet. If people aren't prompted to make a more secure password, a lot of times that's what they type in. It's a really bad idea because it's one of the first things, one of the first things that hackers try to guess whenever they're trying to guess your password, just kind of running through common possibilities. So certainly, if you enter your password as this literal, that's really silly. Don't do that. So in this lesson, we reminded ourselves about the string data type, and we looked at some different common operators that you can use on it, the concatenation operator, the repetition operator, and the equality test.